Sometimes the deepest secrets are hidden in plain sight. In a town called Dead Man's Gulch, a place where fortunes were made and reputations were buried, a wealthy widow made an offer that would shake the territory to its core. Ruby Langston, mistress of a 15,000-acre empire, would give her hand in marriage to any man who could tame a wild, demonic horse that had appeared on her land. 50 men, the strongest and richest from 3 territories, tried their luck, and 50 men failed, leaving with broken bones and shattered pride. Then a lone drifter appeared at her gates, a man with a crippling limp, a worn-out saddle, and nothing to his name. The whole town laughed, but this man was not what he seemed. The horse was not what it seemed. And the widow's challenge was about to uncover a truth so dark it had been buried for 15 years. A truth that would cost someone their life. The Langston estate was a kingdom carved from rock and ambition. The main house sat on a hill, a monument of timber and glass that looked down on the valley. Ruby Langston stood on the veranda, coffee in her hand, watching the sun bleed across the horizon. At 47, she had the kind of beauty that was forged, not gifted. Her hair was shot through with silver she refused to hide, and her green eyes held the ghosts of both great love and greater loss. Her late husband, Marcus Langston, had been a railroad baron, a man who devoured land and spat out gold. He had built this empire with ruthless hands, and when his lungs finally gave out 3 years ago, he left all of it to her. The ranch, the mines, the railroad shares. An empire of wealth and an empire of loneliness. She twisted a simple gold band on her right hand, not one of the gaudy jewels Marcus had draped her in, but the first thing he ever gave her, bought with his last silver dollar back when he was just a man with a dream. A dream that had eventually consumed him, building walls around his heart that even she couldn't climb. "Morning, Mrs. Langston." Tom Fletcher, her foreman, limped towards her. He'd been with Marcus from the start, a man whose loyalty was as solid as the mountains that ringed the valley. He was one of the only men she trusted. "Sleep at all?" he asked, his eyes full of a worry he tried to hide. Ruby let out a laugh that had no warmth in it. "About as much as a rabbit in a coyote den, Tom." The truth was, the 8-bedroom mansion felt like a tomb. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on her, night after night. Her life was a gilded cage, and she was desperate for a way out. The desperation had a name. 2 nights ago, it had torn through her fences like a storm, a stallion, black as a starless midnight, meaner than a rattler in a boot. He'd scattered her prize mares, injured 2 of them, and fought the ranch hands with a fury that wasn't just wild. It was intelligent. They'd finally cornered him in the big round corral down by the barn. The hands called him Diablo. The name fit. Later that day in town, the stories were already spreading. The Silver Dollar Saloon was buzzing with it. Ruby walked in, and the room fell quiet for a half-second before the vultures started circling. These were the men who saw her as a prize. Ranchers, cattle barons, investors from Denver. They didn't see a woman. They saw a walking ledger of land and gold. "Ruby, darling," cooed Jake Morrison, a cattle buyer whose smile never reached his eyes. He'd been sniffing around her property for months. "Heard you've got a little horse problem. I've broken my share of broncs. Be happy to handle it for you." The offers came thick and fast. One man boasted of his firm hand. Another, Pete Carlson, a neighbor with a cruel streak, suggested starving the horse into submission, maybe a few licks with a quirt to remind it who was boss. Ruby's jaw tightened. "I won't have any animal on my land mistreated, Pete. You'd do well to remember that." They didn't understand. They saw a beast to be broken, an obstacle to her fortune. Not one of them looked at the animal and saw what she saw, magnificent, powerful, and terrified. They wanted to conquer it, just like they wanted to conquer her. And in that moment, in the smoky air of the saloon, surrounded by greedy men, a wild, reckless idea sparked in her mind. It was insane. It was brilliant. It was the only way. She stood up, and the room slowly quieted. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a shard of glass, "I've decided how to handle this." She let the silence hang, feeling the weight of every hungry gaze. "I'll make an offer. The man who can gentle Diablo, not break him, not beat him, but earn his trust, that man can have my hand in marriage." The saloon erupted. Men were shouting, laughing, looking at her like she'd gone mad. And maybe she had. But as Ruby walked out, leaving the chaos behind her, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. She was no longer the prize. She had just built the lock. Now, she would see if there was a man in the world who could find the key. The news of Ruby's challenge spread like a plague. By sunrise the next day, the road to the Langston Ranch was choked with riders. They came from all over, Wyoming, Colorado, Texas, their faces etched with greed and ambition. They were all hard men, men who believed the world could be bent to their will with enough force. Ruby watched from her porch as they set up a makeshift camp, their campfires dotting the fields like angry eyes. Diablo stood in the center of the round corral, a black statue of defiance. He watched the gathering horde, his ears pinned, his nostrils flared. He was a king in a cage, surrounded by usurpers. The first to try was Jake Morrison, the cattle buyer. He strutted into the corral, rope in hand, his chest puffed out. For a second, Ruby felt a pang of doubt. What if it was this simple? What if this arrogant peacock was the one? Then Diablo moved. It wasn't a charge, it was an explosion. The stallion moved with a brutal, liquid grace. He snatched the rope from Jake's hand and flung him across the corral like a rag doll. Jake's confident shouts turned to panicked screams. He scrambled out of the pen, his fancy clothes ripped, his pride bleeding into the dust. He limped away without a word, his face a mask of shame and fury. He was the first. He wouldn't be the last. Day after day, the spectacle continued. It became less a challenge and more a public humiliation. Frank Hutchkins, an old rancher, tried to sweet-talk the horse with oats. Diablo let him get close, then lashed out with his front hooves, missing Frank's head by inches and sending him diving for the fence. Pete Carlson, the cruel one, tried to rope him from horseback. Diablo tolerated it for about 10 minutes. Then, from a standing start, he cleared the 6-foot corral fence. The crowd scattered as 1,500 pounds of furious horse landed among them. It took 6 men to get him back in the pen. The horse wasn't just fighting. He was learning. He was adapting. He seemed to enjoy making fools of these men who saw him as nothing more than a dumb beast. By the 3rd day, the ranch had turned into a carnival. Vendors sold beer and roasted meat. A betting pool was started, with odds on how long each man would last. Ruby watched it all with a growing sense of disgust. This wasn't what she wanted. She had wanted to find a man of character, a man of patience. Instead, she had attracted a swarm of brutes and gamblers. The worst came on the 4th day. A mountain of a man named Bronson Bull, who carried a bullwhip. The sound of it cracking echoed across the ranch, a promise of pain. "Listen here, devil horse," Bronson bellowed. "I ain't about to be made a fool of." But he was. Diablo didn't wait for the whip to land. He charged, not blindly, but with a terrifying focus. He didn't trample Bronson. He reared, his massive hooves coming down just inches from the man's head, driving him to his knees in the dirt. Bronson scrambled out of the corral, his face pale with a fear that went deeper than just physical harm. He had looked into the horse's eyes and seen an intelligence that unnerved him to his core. 19 men had tried. 19 had failed. Some were hurt. All were humiliated. The pile of broken bridles and ripped saddles outside the corral grew, a monument to broken pride. That night, Ruby sat on her porch, nursing a whiskey. She was starting to think this had been a terrible mistake. She had wanted to find a partner, someone who understood that true strength was gentle. Instead, she had created a blood sport. Having second thoughts, Tom Fletcher joined her, his own glass in hand. "Third and fourth thoughts," she admitted. These men They don't see the horse, Tom. They see an obstacle. They see a prize. A horse like that, Tom said, his gaze fixed on the corral where Diablo paced restlessly. Maybe force is all he understands. But Ruby shook her head. No, I don't believe that. He's not just mindless fury. He's thinking. He's adapting. There's something else going on with him. Something broken. The next week was a blur of more failures. A rodeo champion from Texas, a rich kid from Denver with a silver-studded saddle that Diablo stomped into a twisted piece of scrap metal. By the end of the second week, 37 men had faced the stallion, and 37 men had been defeated. The challenge had become a legend, but for Ruby, it was a failure. She had been looking for a man who understood that some things, hearts, spirits, wild horses, could not be conquered. They had to be earned. On the morning that marked 3 weeks since her announcement, she stood by the corral at dawn. In the quiet gray light, Diablo was grazing peacefully. He looked almost serene. "You're not really wild, are you?" she whispered. "Someone trained you once, someone you trusted. What happened? Who hurt you?" The horse lifted its head, and for a fleeting moment their eyes met. Ruby felt a jolt, a flash of recognition. She was looking at a kindred spirit, another soul that had been betrayed and now held the world at bay with a wall of fury. The morning brought challengers 38 through 45. They were dispatched with an almost bored efficiency. Diablo had their number. He knew their tricks, their bluster, their reliance on brute force. He defeated them all. By the time the 50th man was tossed headfirst into the water trough, Ruby had made a decision. This circus was over. That evening, she told Tom to send everyone home. "The challenge is off," she said, her voice heavy with resignation. Her grand, foolish idea had failed. She hadn't found a partner. She had only proven that the world was full of men who didn't know the first thing about real strength. As the last of the defeated suitors rode away, a profound silence fell over the ranch. It was just her and the magnificent, untamable horse, a symbol of her hopes, and now the instrument of their destruction. She stood by the corral, watching him in the twilight. She had lost. But as she turned to go back to her empty mansion, a lone figure appeared on the road. A man on a tired-looking bay mare, leading his horse with a pronounced limp. He was unremarkable. Medium height, lean, with clothes that were clean but patched. He stopped at the gate, and even from a distance Ruby could feel it, a quiet stillness, a competence that didn't need to be announced. He wasn't like the others, not at all. And as he looked from her to the horse, his gaze thoughtful and intelligent, Ruby felt a shiver of something she couldn't name. The challenge wasn't over. It was just beginning. His name was Eli Boone. He stood on her back porch, hat in hand, his gaze not on her fortune or her face, but on the horse in the corral. "I understand you have a horse that needs working with," he said. His voice was raspy, like it had been scraped by dust and time. The phrase struck her. Working with, not breaking, not taming. It implied a partnership. 50 men have tried, Mr. Boone, she said, her voice cautious. 50 have failed. Some were hurt. Eli nodded slowly, his eyes still on Diablo. Tom mentioned that. Also mentioned that most of them went in thinking they could master the animal with force. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were brown with flecks of gold, and they held a patience that seemed as old as the mountains. "And you think differently?" "I think," Eli said, his voice quiet but firm, "that any creature that's smart and that's strong doesn't get broken. It gets partnered with." He asked about the horse's history. No one else had asked. They had only boasted of their own. Ruby found herself telling him everything, how the horse had appeared, the lack of a brand, the raw, intelligent fury. Eli listened, truly listened, his head cocked to one side. "That's not a wild horse," he said finally. "Someone spent a lot of time with him once. The way he stands, the way he holds his head, that's trained posture. The question isn't how to break him. The question is, what happened to break his trust?" The insight was so sharp, so accurate, it stole her breath. This man, this drifter with a limp, saw more in 10 minutes than 50 other men had seen in 3 weeks. She found herself inviting him in for coffee, sitting with him at her own kitchen table. He didn't boast. He didn't make promises. He just asked questions and listened. He spoke of patience, of letting the horse get used to his presence, of building a relationship one honest moment at a time. It was so different from the swagger and bluster she had endured for weeks. The other men seemed to think speed was important, she observed. Speed's important when you're trying to impress an audience, Eli said, his gaze steady. It's less important when you're trying to heal something that's been betrayed. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Ruby felt as if he was talking about more than just the horse. He was talking about her. Before he left the kitchen, he looked her straight in the eye. "Mrs. Langston, can I ask you something? This challenge, is it really about the horse?" The question was so direct it disarmed her. She found herself telling him the truth, about her loneliness, about the suitors who saw her as a bank vault, not a woman. "And you figured a man who could understand a horse like Diablo," Eli finished for her, his voice soft with understanding, "might be more likely to understand you." It was a relief to have it spoken aloud. To be seen, truly seen for the first time in years. "Something like that," she admitted, her cheeks flushing. Eli simply nodded. "Makes sense to me. His first attempt wasn't an attempt at all. He didn't enter the corral. He didn't bring a rope. He simply pulled up an old wooden crate about 20 feet from the fence and sat down. And he waited. For hours. Diablo raged. He snorted. He charged the fence. He kicked up dust. Eli didn't flinch. He just sat there, a still point in the stallion's storm. The few remaining spectators grew bored and drifted away. There was no action, no drama, just a man, sitting, and a horse, watching. But Ruby saw it. Something was happening. A silent conversation was beginning. When evening fell, Eli stood up stiffly and walked back to the bunkhouse without having said a word. It looked like nothing had been accomplished. But Ruby knew better. He hadn't tried to conquer the horse's space. He had simply offered his time. It was the first day. And for the first time, Diablo didn't seem angry. He seemed curious. The second day, Eli did the same thing. He sat on his crate, occupying his hands with a piece of leather he was braiding. But this time, something was different. Diablo didn't rage. The stallion stood at the far end of the corral, watching Eli with an intense, focused curiosity. "He's trying to solve you," Ruby murmured to herself from the porch. At midday, Eli got up and walked to the barn. Diablo didn't relax. He moved to the fence, his eyes following Eli until he was out of sight. A low nicker, a sound of frustration, escaped the horse. "Well, I'll be," Tom Fletcher said, appearing at her side. "The horse is starting to miss him when he's gone." When Eli returned, he brought a chair and moved it a few feet closer to the fence, and then he began to talk. His voice was a low, steady murmur. He wasn't commanding the horse. He was just talking. He spoke of the weather, of a ranch he'd worked in Montana, of a smart gray mare named Patience who could predict storms. Diablo's response was stunning. The stallion walked across the corral and stood directly opposite Eli, just on the other side of the fence. He lowered his head, his ears cocked forward, and he listened. For the rest of the afternoon, man and horse remained that way, locked in a one-sided conversation that felt more intimate than any touch. As the sun began to set, Diablo did something that made Ruby's heart leap into her throat. He stretched his neck over the fence and, for a fraction of a second, touched his nose to the top rail, right in front of Eli. It was a question, an offering, a first, fragile thread of trust. Eli didn't move. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't push for more. He respected the boundary. He had been given a gift, and he treated it as precious. That night, Ruby couldn't sleep. She kept replaying that moment. the gentle touch, the quiet acceptance. This wasn't horse training. This was something else entirely. It was a kind of healing. And she realized with a startling clarity that she wasn't just watching Eli heal the horse, he was healing her too. On the third day, Eli's stories shifted. He spoke of his past, of a commanding officer in the cavalry, a Colonel Richardson who believed that breaking a horse's spirit was the same as breaking a man's. He taught us that a horse that trusted you would carry you through hell. Eli's voice drifted up to the porch. But one that feared you would dump you at the first sign of real trouble. This was the first time he'd mentioned the cavalry. It explained his limp, his discipline, his deep understanding of partnership under pressure. Diablo seemed to hang on every word, as if the stories of military mounts and battlefield loyalty resonated with something deep inside him, as if he remembered. That afternoon, Eli rose from his chair and walked right up to the fence. Ruby held her breath, expecting the horse to bolt, to rear, to revert to the demon of the past weeks. But Diablo stood his ground. He watched Eli approach, his eyes soft and intelligent. Eli reached out his hand, not through the fence, but just above it. "Hello, boy," he said softly. "Think we're ready for this?" Diablo stretched his neck and touched Eli's open palm with his nose. A firm, deliberate contact. A handshake. An agreement. The bond was forming, visible and real. But their quiet progress had not gone unnoticed. Jake Morrison returned that evening, his swagger back in place, though his eyes darted nervously towards the corral. "Heard the drifter is still trying to sweet-talk your horse," he sneered at Ruby. "Mr. Boone is making more progress than 50 other men combined," she said, her voice cold. Just then, Eli approached from the barn. Jake turned on him. "So you're the horse whisperer. All this talk about patience and respect. That horse needs a firm hand, not bedtime stories." "Respect isn't something you can force," Eli replied calmly. "It's something you earn." "And you think you've earned it?" Jake laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "That horse almost killed me. You think he's just going to roll over for you because you've been reading him fairy tales?" The confrontation was escalating. Jake's jealousy was a poison in the air. He saw Eli's success as a personal insult. He saw Ruby's growing admiration for the quiet man, and it was driving him mad. "You're being played, Ruby," Jake hissed, stepping closer to her. "This drifter is taking advantage of your soft heart. He's running a con and you're falling for it." The accusation struck a nerve. Was she? Was her loneliness making her see things that weren't there? She looked at Eli, then at the horse. Diablo, who had been calm, was now agitated, sensing the hostility in Jake's voice. He began to pace, his ears flat against his head. He was reacting to Jake's aggression, protecting Eli. "The horse knows the difference, Jake," she said, her voice shaking with a sudden, fierce conviction. "He can sense your intentions, and he doesn't like them." "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice now hard as steel. "Good evening." Jake stormed away, his face thunderous. "When this all falls apart, Ruby, don't say I didn't warn you," he shouted over his shoulder. The threat hung in the twilight air. Ruby and Eli were left alone on the porch. The silence was thick with unspoken feelings. She had defended him. She had chosen a side. "Thank you," she said finally, "for not letting him provoke you." Eli's gaze was on the corral. "A man like that sees every situation as a contest," he said, his voice low. "Sometimes the best way to win is not to play." Ruby looked at him, really looked at him, at the lines on his face, the quiet strength in his eyes, the gentle set of his jaw. She realized with a jolt that she wasn't just impressed with him. She was falling for him, and that was a complication she hadn't been prepared for. A dangerous, wonderful, terrifying complication. The next morning, Ruby was in the attic, looking for old ledgers, when her hand brushed against a small, dusty trunk. A trunk she hadn't opened since Marcus died. On impulse, she lifted the lid. Inside, beneath folded linens, was a pair of silver spurs. Not the fancy ones her husband wore for show, but his old, worn working spurs from the days before the railroad, before the fortune, before he had changed. As she held them, a memory surfaced. A conversation from years ago. Marcus, laughing about an old friend from his rough-and-tumble youth, a man he'd prospected with. A brilliant horseman, a decorated cavalry officer who had fallen from grace. Colonel Marcus Thorne. The name hit her like a physical blow. She dropped the spurs and rushed to her late husband's desk downstairs. Frantically, she searched through his old papers until she found it. A small, locked box. Her hands trembled as she forced the lock. Inside was a single faded photograph. A young, smiling Marcus Langston, his arm around another man in a cavalry uniform, and in the man's hand was the lead rope of a magnificent black stallion. Ruby's blood ran cold. The man in the picture was Colonel Marcus Thorne. And the horse. The horse was Diablo. But that wasn't the worst of it. Tucked behind the photo was a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline screamed, "Cavalry hero disgraced. Colonel Thorne court-martialed for cowardice." The article detailed a disastrous battle at a place called Wolf Creek. It said Thorne had abandoned his men, and the key witness who had testified against him, sealing his fate, was his own second-in-command. A man praised for his bravery in the same battle, a man named Captain Elias J. Boone. Captain Elias J. Boone, Eli. She felt the floor drop out from under her. It was all a lie, all of it. The humble drifter, the patient approach, the quiet wisdom. He wasn't just a former cavalryman. He was a central figure in the very tragedy that had created this horse's trauma. He knew this horse. He knew its history. He had known all along. She stormed out of the house, the photo and the clipping clutched in her hand. She found him by the corral, speaking softly to the horse. "You knew," she said, her voice a strangled whisper. "You knew who he was from the beginning." Eli turned, and the look on his face was not of surprise, but of deep, weary resignation. He had been waiting for this. "Ruby, I can explain." "Explain what?" she cried, her voice breaking. "That this whole week has been a performance? A lie? You used this horse's pain, a pain you helped create, to win my trust, to win my challenge." The accusation hung between them, ugly and sharp. "The approach was genuine, Ruby," he said, his voice pleading. "Everything I told you about patience and trust, that was real. The only thing I concealed was my past." "Your past is the whole point," she shot back. "Why Eli? Why hide it?" He looked away, towards the distant mountains. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Because if I had told you the truth, you would have seen a hero, a symbol, not a man, the same way everyone else does." But then his story took another turn. The official record was a lie. Colonel Thorne hadn't been a coward. He had sacrificed himself, drawing fire to allow his men, including Eli, to escape an ambush. But the general in charge of the campaign was corrupt. He needed a scapegoat to cover his own fatal blunders. He'd pinned it on the dead colonel and coerced his captain Eli into testifying to a false story, threatening him with a court-martial of his own if he refused. "I betrayed him, Ruby," Eli whispered, the words tasting like ash. "I betrayed the best man I ever knew to save my own skin. My leg," he gestured to his limp. "I wasn't wounded in battle. Thorne was already dead. I was injured trying to pull his body from the field. The medal they gave me, it's a monument to my shame." Ruby stared at him, her mind reeling. This wasn't a simple deception. It was a tragedy of honor, betrayal, and guilt that had haunted him for 15 years. He hadn't come here to win a prize. He had come here seeking, what? Redemption? Forgiveness? He had seen Diablo, Valor, as the horse was originally named, and recognized a fellow survivor of the same catastrophe. His patient work wasn't a trick. It was an apology, a penance. But before she could process this earth-shattering new truth, they were interrupted. Jake Morrison rode up, and he wasn't alone. He had 2 other men with him, rough-looking types with cruel eyes. And Jake was holding a newspaper. "Well, well, well," Jake sneered, his voice dripping with triumph. "Looks like the truth is finally coming out. I did some digging on our mysterious horse whisperer." He held up the paper. It was an old edition, but the headline was clear. It was the same one Ruby held in her hand. "Turns out your humble drifter is none other than Captain Elias Boone, the man who sent my own cousin, Marcus Thorne, to a disgraced grave." Cousin. The word hit Ruby like a stray bullet. Jake wasn't just a suitor. He was family. He was here for revenge. "This was never about you or your money, Ruby," Jake spat, his face contorted with hate. "This was about him. I wanted to see him fail. I wanted to see this horse, my cousin's horse, destroy him." The situation was spiraling out of control. Jake's men were dismounting, their intentions clear. They were closing in on Eli. "This ends today," Jake snarled. "I'm taking my cousin's horse, and I'm going to make sure this traitor gets what he deserves." But as they moved forward, a figure stepped out from the barn, Tom Fletcher, and he was holding a shotgun. "You ain't touching either of them," Tom said, his voice low and dangerous. Jake laughed. "You and what army, old man?" "The army of the truth," Tom said, and his eyes met Eli's. "I was there, at Wolf Creek. I was a sergeant in your company, Captain. I saw what really happened. And I've kept my mouth shut for 15 years. Well, no more." The final secret was about to be revealed, and it was going to change everything. Tom Fletcher's voice, steady and clear, cut through the tense silence. The general's report was a lie, every word of it. He looked from Jake to the ranch hands who had gathered, drawn by the confrontation. His gaze was unflinching. "Colonel Thorne wasn't a coward. He was the bravest man I ever saw." He began to tell the real story of Wolf Creek. The story of a botched campaign led by a glory-seeking general who marched them straight into a perfectly laid trap. They were outnumbered 5-1, pinned down in a rocky canyon with no hope of escape. The general panicked, but Colonel Thorne did not. "He saw only one way out," Tom said, his voice thick with the memory. "A narrow pass at the end of the canyon, but it was covered by warriors on the ridge, a suicide run. Colonel Thorne gave the order for the company to retreat through the pass. But he didn't go with them. He and his horse, Valor, charged the other way, directly at the main enemy force. It was a deliberate sacrifice, a desperate, heroic feint to draw the fire and give his men the few precious seconds they needed to escape. "He saved us," Tom said, his eyes now on Eli. "All of us. Captain Boone here tried to go after him, tried to pull him back. That's when he took the lance to his leg. It wasn't the enemy that brought him down. It was one of our own men, under orders from the general to stop him from getting himself killed." The truth was devastating. Eli hadn't betrayed a hero. He had been forced to watch one die. The corrupt general, needing to hide his incompetence, had buried the truth along with the colonel. He'd created a story of cowardice and forced his surviving captain, a wounded and grief-stricken Eli, to corroborate it under threat of court-martial. The medal for gallantry wasn't for his actions in the battle, but for his silence after. Jake Morrison stared, his face ashen. The story he had clung to, the story of his cousin's shame that had fueled his hatred for years, was a lie. His quest for revenge had been aimed at the wrong man. I didn't know," he stammered, his bravado gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed shock. "Of course you didn't," Ruby said, her voice soft but firm. "No one did. That was the point." She looked at Eli, and for the first time, she saw the full weight of the burden he had been carrying. Not just a physical limp, but a soul-deep wound of guilt and grief. He hadn't been trying to win her challenge. He had been trying to apologize to the only other living soul who knew the truth of what happened that day. The horse. As if understanding that the story was finally told, Diablo, Valor, let out a long, low sound. It wasn't a sound of anger or defiance. It was a sound of sorrow, of release. He walked to the fence, pushed his great head over the rails, and rested it on Eli's shoulder. All the fury, the years of pain and confusion melted away in that one gesture. Eli wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, his face buried in the coarse black mane, and his body shook with silent, racking sobs. 15 years of lies, of shame, of silent suffering poured out of him. He wasn't talking to the people anymore. He was talking to the horse, his words muffled and broken. "I'm sorry, Valor. I'm so sorry. I should have told them. I should have died with him." Ruby's heart broke for him, for both of them. She stepped forward, past the stunned onlookers, past the humbled Jake Morrison. She opened the corral gate. She walked in and stood beside them, placing her hand on Eli's back. She didn't say anything. There were no words for this. There was only presence, only shared silence. The horse lifted his head and looked at her, his eyes impossibly deep and intelligent. He nuzzled her hand, then Eli's, linking them together. The challenge was over, not because a horse had been tamed, but because a truth had been set free. In the days that followed, a quiet healing settled over the ranch. The specter of the past, once unleashed, began to lose its power. Jake Morrison, stripped of his hatred, was a changed man. He offered a halting, humbled apology to Eli and left Dead Man's Gulch the next morning, leaving behind his quest for a vengeance that had been built on a lie. The story, thanks to Tom Fletcher, spread through the territory. An official inquiry was opened, and though the corrupt general was long dead, Colonel Thorne's name was posthumously cleared. His honor was restored. But the real healing was happening in the round corral. Eli no longer sat outside the fence. He spent his days inside with Valor, not training him, but simply being with him. They would stand for hours, man and horse, two survivors of the same tragedy, finding solace in each other's company. Ruby watched them, her heart full of a love so fierce and protective it astonished her. This quiet, broken, honorable man had walked through fire and emerged with his soul intact. One morning, she walked down to the corral. Eli was leaning against Valor's flank, his eyes closed. The horse was perfectly still, a black mountain of calm. "Eli," she said softly. He opened his eyes. They were clearer than she had ever seen them, the ghosts of shame finally laid to rest. "The challenge I made," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "It was for my hand in marriage." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I know." "Well," she said, taking a deep breath, "the offer still stands, but the terms have changed." She walked closer until she was standing right in front of him. "I'm not a prize to be won, Eli, and you are not a man who needs to prove his worth, so I'm asking you, not as a winner of a challenge, but as my partner, as the man I love. Will you build a life with me?" His eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not tears of sorrow. He reached out and cupped her face in his scarred, gentle hands. "Ruby Langston," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Nothing would make me prouder." It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something better. It was real. It was two broken souls finding wholeness in each other, forging a new future from the ashes of a painful past. Their wedding was a small, quiet affair held in the shade of the cottonwood trees by the creek. Tom Fletcher stood as Eli's best man. Martha Henderson stood as Ruby's maid of honor, and standing beside them, his black coat gleaming in the sun, was Valor. No saddle, no bridle. Just a quiet, dignified presence. A partner, a witness, a friend. They built a new sign for the ranch entrance. It didn't say Langston Ranch anymore, it said Boone Langston Ranch. And underneath, Eli had carved a single line, "Where trust is earned." Life settled into a new rhythm. The ranch flourished under their shared guidance. Eli's gentle methods of horsemanship became legendary, drawing visitors from far and wide who wanted to learn the difference between breaking a horse and partnering with one. Valor sired a line of foals known for their intelligence and gentle strength. And one spring morning, a year after their wedding, The sound of a baby's cry filled the rooms of the once empty mansion, chasing away the last of the shadows for good. Ruby would often stand on the porch, her child in her arms, and watch her husband ride out across their land. He rode Valor now, not with a bit and spurs, but with a simple, soft halter and the lightest of touches. They moved as one, a seamless union of strength and trust. She had set out a challenge to find a man who could tame a demon. But in the end, she found something far more profound. She found a man who knew that the wildest things in this world aren't meant to be tamed. They are meant to be understood and loved. They are meant to be set free. The story of Ruby, Eli, and the horse once called Diablo became a quiet legend in that corner of the world. It was a reminder that the deepest wounds can heal, that truth can rise from the deepest graves, and that sometimes the most broken souls find each other and create something stronger and more beautiful than anything they could have been alone. It's a story about how real strength isn't about the force you can exert, but about the trust you can inspire. If this story of hidden truths and hard-won love moved you, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit that notification bell. Because the secrets buried in places like Dead Man's Gulch are far from over, and you won't want to miss the next story we dig up.